Welcome. I'm Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center for Recovery and the Radical Recovery Series. And I'm here with two of Peter Levine's senior teachers, and we're going to talk about somatic experiencing and how that relates to addiction. So we have Abby Blakeslee and Joshua Sylvae, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves a little bit. And if you could tell us how you got involved in this and what it is, the short notes on what it is that you do and what is interesting about this for you. And that's where we'll start. So go ahead, Abby.
Thank you. First of all, I really want to give my appreciation for being invited on the program and to also share an opportunity to share more about somatic experiencing with all of the listeners here.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we're very excited to have you here.
Thank you. So my name is Dr. Abby Blakeslee. I have a PhD in clinical and somatic psychology. Somatic means body-oriented. And I'm a body worker as well, many years of experience in different somatic modalities. But my path has always led me back to somatic experiencing. And one of the things, if we look at the word somatic experiencing, somatic is body oriented, and experiencing is a verb. It's happening in the present moment. So, really to me, the healing happens in the here and now. So that's really there's a present-centered focus on working with what's occurring in our bodies and in our experience and beginning to shift with our attention, with our awareness, through our physiology, some of that experience that leads to a deeper sense of connection with ourselves, with others, and with the world. So that path for me of coming back to somatic experiencing is just that it's really a practice, and it's changed my biology so deeply in studying it and working with Dr. Peter Levine for so many years, and many of the other faculty members and our participants and many cohorts and my clients. It really works. So that's another reason I light up when I talk about SE. Because it's not just a method or a tool, but it's a way of being that really helps us to reconnect to our instinctual selves and find more capacity for joy, pleasure, presence, all the things that we want to be our best true selves.
Mm-hmm. So the mindfulness is a big part of it, the present moment, being in the present moment, and how trauma takes us out of that. We have to find a way to come back.
It is. And SE differs from mindfulness. Joshua may have some more to say about this too, in that we attend in somatic experiencing sometimes to particular things in our internal experience rather than others. So in mindfulness, we're going to be just sort of noticing more of what is. We're going to be allowing what is, feeling the sensations, the emotions, the thought. And there could be layers of healing that occurs from mindfulness. It's certainly a very, very important tool and experience. But in SE, we're often looking at where is the trauma and where is the resilience? And when do we attend to what signals? And we can talk a little bit more about that. So there's more of a specificity in our work, which shifts it from just a mindfulness-based practice.
Right. Oh, thank you. So Joshua, why don't you jump in here and tell us about you? How did you get involved and what excites you about this work?
Yeah, it's exciting work, and always an honor to get to talk about SE. As I think Abby mentioned as well, I'm a satisfied customer as well as a proponent. So it's been a really marvelous journey for myself as well. But yeah, my name's Joshua Sylvae. I have hold a master's degree also in clinical somatic psychology from I think from the same institute as Abby, and then also a PhD in higher learning and social change. And that speaks a little bit to my journey with SE. I came to SE also to sort out kind of what's going on in the modern world and seeing how our culture seems to be headed in directions that really aren't healthful or just. And the curiosity about that is what initially actually led me to somatic experiencing. And I discovered in SE a really compelling body of theory and practice pointing to how the human nervous system, as with other mammalian nervous systems, is really designed to be able to rapidly restore our functioning in the aftermath of extreme events. Dr. Levine's pithy formulation for this was, why do animals in the wild, though threatened routinely, rarely become traumatized? So what is it about, modern humans and our domesticated animals that leaves us vulnerable to traumatization? So I found this marvelous SE training and went through it and got more and more inspired by the work of SE, and have made it kind of my life's work at this point. And one of the things that I think about in terms of somatic experiencing is its bottom-up focus. As Abby mentioned, it's not just a method or a technique. It's really a way of being, and particularly a way of being with clients and others that assists this nervous system of ours to come back into its intrinsic balance, or as Levine puts it, the intrinsic regulatory capacity of the organism. And, that seems really important to me, that we're not just focused on, here's what you do to make yourself feel a little bit better, but rather we're coming in to support the system itself to regain its balance. And then, as clinicians, as people, we don't have to work so hard to feel okay. So
Right.
It's kind of a big goal of mine, is to, bring that to my clients for sure, to the healers that I train in my trainings, but also hopefully to the world at large.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we were just talking about how so many people are triggered right now in our global situation and political situation and climate change and all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Very difficult time right now for people.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Very uncertain.
So I know we're going to get into the long answer a little bit here, but do you have a short answer to that question of Peter's? Why is it that humans are so traumatized by these events?
Well, one of the things that I think about a lot is that modern humans, for the last little while, have been engaged in a really interesting experiment, which we call civilization. It's a really, really different way of being on the planet than our ancestors practiced for, depending on how you look at it, potentially millions of years.
Right.
And I think that, if we think about civilization or domestication, I'll call it our 10,000 year long love affair with control, where we've begun to control more and more of how the nature around us expresses itself. And I think one of the unfortunate, unforeseen consequences of that is that we set out to subdue and control our own nature as well, and have unintentionally begun to interrupt the processes that assist our nervous system in restoring its own wholeness and health. And that's actually what creates the traumatic reaction. Right.
And then we get less and less able to just flow along with what's going on. When we get into that control thing, things have to be, we have a very narrow window of tolerance, which leads us into talking about somatic experiencing.
Very good. Nice segue.
So good segue into that. So would you like me to start the slide now, Abby?
Sure. Let me talk a little bit more about somatic experiencing, and I can also follow up a little bit more too about your question that you just asked Joshua after we look at these slides. In somatic experiencing, we have some different clinical models. Models of regulation would be one way that we could call it. And if you look at this chart here, you'll see that there are two lines, and that represents what we would call a window of tolerance. The upper line, it says sympathetic. And if I could, I'd draw a little arrow going up towards the squirrel, right? So when you think about a squirrel, they have a fantastic sympathetic nervous system, right? Scurry, scurry, scurry. And then they sort of arrest and pause and look around. Scurry, scurry, scurry. They're very fast. It's for excitation. If you were then to look at the bottom line and then point an arrow down, that would be for the parasympathetic nervous system. This is for relaxation. Okay? And one of our goals is that we'd like to help a person's, I'm going to call it autonomic function. This is the autonomic nervous system. Okay? Be able to have a resilient range where it can fluidly go up and down from sympathetic, settle down, back down into parasympathetic, or rest and digest, right? Like a wave. Now, this would be a manageable range between arousal and settling, or activation and deactivation, where that nobody is getting sort of stuck in any high arousal or stuck in any deep low arousal. And if you look over to the left, you'll see a lightning bolt. And we talk about trauma as being a lightning bolt out from the blue. Freud talks about trauma as being a breach in the protective barrier of the self. And many times these are events that happen too fast, too soon, too quickly to integrate. As in with developmental trauma, it can be too little for too long. Right? There may be multiple types of traumas that occur that create this breach in the barrier of the self. And it's like a rupture. And it affects autonomic functioning. So what we see is that the body will go into instinctual, predictable instinctual phases for protection. So here you see that red line going up high above the window of tolerance into sympathetic arousal. Here, right, we might be fighting or fleeing if we have the possibility to be able to do that. If that happens for too long, or if our lower instinctual brain decides that an active defensive response is not going to optimize our survival, and again, it's a lower brain response, then we may get stuck on off. This is a freeze response. We call it immobility. There can be tonic immobility. It's an analgesic effect, so there's numbing. And this is a deep parasympathetic response. Okay, so it's not the gentle rest and digest, but it's a deep parasympathetic response that we share with animals that go into hibernation. Okay? And there are very different physiological kinds of things that occur when you're stuck on high or stuck on low, or stuck on sympathetic or stuck in the deep parasympathetic. And if you look here, you can see for many people who are stuck in the high sympathetic, there can be lots of different clinical symptoms. People with anxiety, right? Dry mouth, heart racing. All of those things are physiologically sympathetic responses. Panic, hyperactivity, exaggerated startle response, insomnia, an inability to relax, restlessness, hypervigilance, digestive problems, lability, a lot of emotional flooding, right? The system is on hyperdrive, extreme emotion. This is just a short list of some of the different kinds of symptoms that you might see when the nervous system is stuck in a highly sympathetic charged state.
Well, and what strikes me about that too is that, I mean, that can really take over your life. Digestive problems, you can't sleep, you've got emotional flooding. I mean, those are the kinds of things that you can't live a normal life if you're stuck on a high alert like that.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And then on the opposite side of that, you find people also suffer when they're stuck on off or in the deep parasympathetic. We see depression, flat affect, lethargy, low impulse, lack of motivation, low energy, lack of feeling, cut off from feeling exhausted, a lot of chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, disorientation, disconnection, dissociation, lots of syndromes, pain, low blood pressure. So some things that fall kind of more into the medical categories, other things that fall more into psychological categories, and poor digestion. But this is really, I think this chart is really important if we're talking about recovery. Because, rather than going back through all of the events that a person has experienced, we can really look at, where are you stuck? Where is your nervous system stuck right now? And when do people use and what do they use? Because a lot of the time, people are trying to access some kind of level of regulation. Yeah? I mean, it's an attempt at regulation. So they're reaching for the drink, or they're reaching for the opioid, or they're reaching for, right, something that they've lost the ability to sort of access their natural pharmacy. And this is something through the process of SE where we can really, if we're working with the lower brain, we're working with the nervous system, we can help people to begin to re-access that natural pharmacy.
Well, and a couple of things that I think are important about that too is that, for one thing, people tend to shame themselves and blame themselves for having these symptoms. And it's really a function of our physiology. That's really important, I think, for people to know. The other thing I think would be that we can work directly with the nervous system. And I've seen so much in the last 5 years in particular about working somatically. And it's wonderful that that's really starting to be known. Like, even psychologists will say, we actually need to be in the body and knowing what's going on in our body in order to work with emotion. Whereas it used to be very much more talk therapy. And so somatic experiencing is and Peter Levine's work has certainly been on the leading edge of bringing that out into the world, of understanding that we need to be working in our body.
Yeah, I would say that if we're hoping to facilitate that more bottom-up reorganization of the nervous system, we're going to need to incorporate that somatic level of experience. As Bessel van der Kolk said when talking about working with trauma, if you're using cognitive behavioral therapy to treat trauma, you're treating the wrong part of the brain.
Right.
Trauma imprints aren't stored in the neocortex, and we're not able to think our way out of trauma. And I would venture that a good number of people struggling with addictions, whether it's substance addictions, behavioral addictions, compulsivity of any kind, there's some kind of nervous system dysregulation that underlies that.
Right.
And these are often strategies, sometimes brilliant strategies that have allowed a person to survive. Right. And help them to regulate their experience. But it's certainly possible that the system can come back into its own intrinsic regulation if given the right supports.
So how would you go about working with somebody? Like, I know there's probably not a typical session, but what could people expect if they're working with a somatic experiencing practitioner?
In a typical somatic experiencing session, one of the first things that I might ask someone is to look around the room, get a sense in the here and now. What do they see around them? Orienting is a very important response. It can be highly stabilizing for certain individuals, not all. And then I'm really tracking and noticing as they're looking around the room, how is that affecting their physiology? Do they take a deep breath and settle? Mm-hmm. Or do they suddenly get connected to themselves a little bit more and then realize how quickly their heart is beating? Or do they feel high levels of constriction, right? Or do you see them tensing up? So we're really tracking as a practitioner, moment by moment, what's unfolding in the physiology. We're also beginning to pay attention to what helps that particular person's nervous system regulate. It could be orienting, it could be sensing the ground underneath them. It might be self-contact. Really, if they bring some of their attention into some of the things often that they're already doing. Do they feel some settling? Do they feel some organization? Or do they feel, if they're stuck on low, do they feel some life energy coming back? Do they feel less pain? And a lot of the time, initially, we're going to be looking for ways that the organism is feeling better and more stable. And as we continue to deepen that, the brain's ability to pay attention to those signals, because of course, when we have trauma signals, the lower brain and the amygdala is going, what's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong? I got to fix it. I got to, right? Pay attention to the worst of the pain. So we might direct attention away from that and to strengthen resources, to strengthen the resiliency of the nervous system of the person. And then we're going to start to work more with the trauma too, right? So as a person thinks about an experience, or maybe working with a pain pattern or a physical tension pattern, we're going to hopefully help the person to become curious about it. And this is where some also mindfulness comes in, where we have a curiosity, a witness that comes online, that starts to watch and to listen and attend. And to notice, if they're paying attention, what begins to happen next. What is happening in the body? What is it wanting to do? And we may find there are ways in which the body might discharge or release activation. It's been stuck in a pattern just by the simple attending. There are different kind of autonomic signals that might happen: shaking, trembling, movement of heat, right? It's kind of like a pressure cooker. Right? And as the steam releases and then everything cools down, right? There's this kind of release that can happen. So we're going to really attend and allow those kinds of experiences with support, and for the person not to interrupt that, right? Oh, I'm cold. Oh, this is weird. Why is my hand moving that way? Oh, why don't you just allow it and to see what happens next? The other thing that we're particularly attending to is sometimes the body has a stored level of survival activation around what the body, kind of what the survival program, I could call it, was that didn't get to complete. It could be a survival program like to reach out for connection, or it could be a defensive strategy like fighting or fleeing, or the body needs time to come out of freeze, right? Enough time to come out of freeze in order to begin to sense what some of those more active defensive strategies were. And there's a feeling in the body that it wants to do something, like it wants to run, it wants to fight, it wants to set a boundary. It could be in the past, but it's a present signal that's recurring over and over. So we're going to get curious, what does your body want to do right now? And allow those movements, allow the images, allow some time for the body to sort of unwind, right, what it has needed to do for a long time, sometimes even decades. Right? And there's then a deep felt shift in the physiology as that gets released or reorganized. And then there's new options in the brain chemistry. There's new potential, because that potentiation, right, that has continued to be what Peter Levine says is that it's like it's all dressed up with nowhere to go.
Right.
But as soon as it finds a channel and the person feels like if anything similar were to happen, then my body could respond by setting a boundary. I couldn't then, but I feel that I can now. That's going to create a different level of empowerment overall in the person's life and increase a level of functioning.
So a child, for instance, children tend to not have a lot of physical power to remove themselves from danger. So a child has been going into pleasing behavior, trying to stay off the radar, trying to stay out of trouble that way. And then they would carry that forward into their adult life, and which of course affects their relationships, their jobs, everything. And so doing this process would kind of get them out of that pattern so that they would have more options. Is that what am I understanding kind of that's how it works?
Joshua, do you want to follow up with that?
I was kind of curious what you might have to say, actually. I'm happy to.
Yeah. So, Lynn, answering your question, absolutely. So it could very much, we work with somatic experiencing as it relates to attachment patterns, right? The way in which that child learned to survive.
Right.
And it's an ongoing pattern, right? And that might not serve them in certain situations. So if they need to ask for a raise, for an example, right? But they're terrified of confrontation. So we would want to work with that as they're thinking about asking for the raise. What happens in their body right now? Or what does that relate to in their childhood? And we might go back and do some work around the child, what the child wanted or needed. Many times when we work with developmental trauma, right, the child is programmed to attach. And we have a biological necessity to attach to our caregivers, which creates a lot of binding when those are the caregivers that are also harming us. So we may need to go back to notice the person's physiology and then imagine if you could step back in time and be an advocate for that child. Or if you imagine that child had gotten the protection they would have wanted or needed, what do you imagine? Or what's the impulse from your body that comes right now? And then we would work with the unfolding in the person's body as they're talking about that, right? Setting the boundary, the flight response, right? The confrontation, but from an adult-centered place. Yeah. And to describe that bind is also really important, right? That was a necessary survival strategy, and they did what they did in order to survive. And many times, what children also need to do is to move more into freeze and dissociation.
So you would help them to understand kind of how this process works. Is that part of what you do during this, or is that kind of at the beginning or the end, or is that just kind of fluid throughout?
For me, it's fluid. It's what is arising in the nervous system, and we're following that bottom-up process. And then there can be educational pieces that come in, because as you said earlier, many people shame and blame themselves. Why didn't I say anything? Why didn't I get out of that situation? What took me so long, right? Or it was my fault.
Right.
I'm a bad person. I'm unlovable at the core. Right? So all of these, shame, kind of again in the physiology, where the body needed to shut down in order to survive, and a lot of thoughts that can revolve around that, around the freeze response, right? Trying to even describe that physiological state that the person is either triggered into in certain kind of situations or remains in chronically over time, which often leads to substance use and abuse.
Yeah, for some folks, to educate them about, our hypotheses, about what drives their behavior can be really helpful. I get an explanatory frame for what's going on with me that makes me feel better, more reassured. But we do want to be careful with that because, especially if there's somebody who has this tendency towards wanting to appease folks. If I tell them my idea about what's going on in their nervous system and how that's affecting them, they may start to think, he wants this to happen. So is there some way that, I can engineer that to happen? Not that they're going to consciously think that, of course, but it may come out in their behavior. And, that can really get in the way of the process. So, we judiciously educate folks, where we think it's going to be beneficial for them. And I'm appreciating also, Abby, the swing back into thinking about recovery. It's like when I was reflecting on the title of your series, Radical Recovery. I'm really liking that. By the way, it's I think really in line with our theory of somatic experiencing and working in this somatic way, because to facilitate this full recovery, a radical recovery, that we do need to in some way transform the way that our body, the way that our nervous system, as Abby was saying, the lower brain, the way that those structures work, the ways that our system processes information. So some of the things that, that as SE practitioners we do to support that include, trying to get this balance between internal and external focus. So one of the things that is sometimes advocated in recovery circles or in mindfulness approaches is just to begin to pay attention to your experience. And for a good number of people, that's really helpful. To start to do mindfulness allows me to settle, allows me to become more present, and it's very beneficial, both short and long term. For some of my traumatized clients, though, when they've attempted to attend to their experience in this mindful way, they've gotten re-traumatized. They've gotten blown out of the water because there's just too much for them to effectively attend to. And so they've walked away from something, again, with this self-blame, this sense of shame, and struggling even more. So one of the things that we'll do is to help people to balance internal and external focus. So I'm attending to my surroundings at the same time as I'm then able to go in and reference what's happening in my body, also in my thoughts and in my emotions. So we work to bring that balance in. And then as Abby was pointing to earlier, one of the things that we would say is a distinction about somatic experiencing vis-a-vis other approaches that incorporate mindfulness is that we may, as practitioners, as clients as well, look to accentuate certain aspects of experience, to pay attention a little bit more readily to certain things at certain times because it's going to be helpful for this goal of regulation. One of those things is to not get caught in the trauma vortex. Mm-hmm. This was Levine's notion of the way that negative experience can really capture our attention, and we can really be readily hijacked by the there and the then of trauma. So at first, we may help people to notice, pay attention to, and enjoy, to savor their positive experience. Mm-hmm. Things that are pleasurable, things that give them a sense of comfort or ease. Those may be the places we go at first to support the system to come into more balance. Mm-hmm. And once that capacity is established, my readiness to attend to pleasure and ease, then my system is more ready to do this easy back and forth that we call pendulation. So one of the core concepts of SE is this idea that the organism is prepared to move back and forth through cycles of expansion and contraction. That's just basic biology. If you think about the heartbeat, if you think about respiration, it's all these cycles of expansion and contraction. And one of the things that gets lost for people when they get traumatized is that pendulation. And, again, referencing, Levine's work, he says that SE is about helping people move from fixity into flow. Right. And I've always really appreciated that, to take a system that's stuck, is not in this easy movement back and forth, and assist it in coming back into that. One of the key things about that will be this movement back and forth between things that are challenging, things that feel hard, stress, and then attending to my sense of pleasure, my sense of comfort, my sense of ease. And it's that back and forth, we think, that can really heal trauma, restore nervous system regulation, rather than diving into the heart of the trauma vortex, or trying to force myself to focus on the positive, or think positive thoughts, or whatever. Right. We try to unite those two polarities and have people easily able to go back and forth.
Mm-hmm. So how do you work with people who are highly traumatized, that's very difficult for? So somebody has spent their whole life avoiding their body and avoiding their past through addiction or something else. And what's that process like for people as they start to tune in? I mean, they have the support of someone, which is very important.
So this is just a follow-up visual for pendulation or expansion and contraction. This is called a Hoberman sphere. I have a red one. I got this at a garage sale, which I was sort of amazed to find. But they have rainbow ones too. And this is a medium size. There's travel sizes. And then the really large one, actually I use a lot with kids. They can even stand in it. A 5-year-old can stand in it. But here's this idea, right, of the expansion and contraction, right? And the expansion of contraction of all things, it's in physics, this idea of pendulation. And you could look at this as the nervous system too, right? So excitation and relaxation. And here we go, right? There's a threat, right? Let's say that it's a real or perceived life threat. And then what happens? We go into a protective mode, active defense. Okay, and then the lower brain goes into maybe a passive defense. Okay, and people can move between this and this rapidly or slowly, or they might be predominantly stuck here. Yeah, they might be predominantly stuck here and have some capacity to return here. So, right, this is a really nice model. And I use this sometimes with families, say, so, this morning when you went to school, or when you're having that conversation at the dinner table, were you here? Were you here? And then the kid will say, well, no, mom was here. So there's a lot of really interesting things that you can do with this. And it's a great little, these visual tools and things that people can feel and touch and use in your office, right? I have a lot of things, tiger and a lot of sensory oriented kinds of things that people can touch, feel, exploration through the 5 senses.
Mm-hmm.
So
want to be somewhat careful with the Hoberman sphere in kids. We have one of these at home as well. My then 5-year-old was playing with it one time in the living room, and all of a sudden I started to hear these whimpering sounds. And then they kind of increased in volume until it was an all-out cry. So we came around the corner. She had got in it to stand, but then it had started to contract.
Yes, you need to keep an eye on that.
Out. She's like, "Get me out of this thing."
Yeah, and little fingers sometimes can get
caught.
Bands and contracts. But if you're watching them,
yeah,
and it's dependent on age, absolutely.
Yeah, right.
I'm watching our 3-year-old with that all the time.
Well, and what strikes me too is that, there's the fight reflex and the freeze, and people with the fight reflex have a lot of higher cost in their relationships and social cost with that kind of a response than people that just kind of shrink into themselves and go numb or something like that.
Although there is a high cost to that. There's the isolation.
Yes.
And really a deep suffering of not being able to motivate and oneself in the world. So, there are different kinds of nervous system representations. And one of the things that we see as we're working with trauma and as there's more autonomic regulation, people come into, it's a biological and a physiological state of social engagement. Right. And that's one of the things that we're working to is a natural movement towards connection. But when you're in a deep, and you're in deep parasympathetic state, or you're in the high sympathetic arousal, that's not a time where we're going to be socially connecting biologically. So the regulation really allows people to have that capacity to reconnect and also get the benefits, right? The feedback, then increased relationship, increased what we call relationship with self, or interoception, one's own awareness of one's own internal sensations. So it's interoception, but then also being able to feel felt. Yeah, so it increases empathy.
Can you say that in a little bit more detail? Felt?
So Daniel Siegel talks about the experience of empathy as feeling felt. Yeah. And when we're able to have a deeper sense of connection to our own internal world, we're going to gather more information as we're observing someone else's eye contact, the way that you're nodding your head, right? And I'm getting a cue that you're interested in what I'm saying, right? nice rapport. And then I'm taking that into my body, and then I'm feeling warm, and I feel the excitement of talking about the topic. And there's nice rapport that happens in the field between us.
Mm-hmm.
And with trauma, a lot of the time there's an inaccuracy, right? Because if I'm in a high sympathetic arousal, I might look at your face and think, everything that I'm saying she thinks is wrong.
Right.
What's wrong with me? She thinks I'm a fraud.
Mm-hmm.
Or I might be more in that shut down place. I don't have anything important to say. She's totally disinterested. Yeah. So again, the interpretation often that we make of others is connected to our own internalized state. Now, you talked about how do you work with someone who's highly traumatized, and we of course work with a lot of complex trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people who walk into an SE session. There's a real big variety that you might see. Some people have some capacity to downregulate. Some people, you can work relatively quickly with some of these traumas. For many, though, with a lot of complex trauma, what you initially need to work with is a level of freeze and dissociation. And dissociation is more of a psychological or a psychic response to overwhelm, where we disconnect from our bodies. And so we're floating out here, or we're a floating head, right? Is the body wet body? Or if we begin to attend to our bodies, there's a lot of the signals that are still there of when we left. So why would I want to go in there?
Right. It's painful, scary. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So in SE, our initial goal is not to get somebody to connect to their bodies, which is interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're looking more at this ability to facilitate pendulation over time and internal and external awareness, like Joshua pointed out earlier. We might use some more externalized kind of awareness, more from the periphery, touching objects, finding an object that they find more interesting in the room, describing it. And then you notice if they settle a little bit, right? You can track from the outside if the physiology is responding. That's facilitating a pendulation, even if you don't ask someone, what are you noticing in your body right now? They're settling. And then they start talking, and then the symptoms and the physiology is escalating or shutting down. And you take a pause and then redirect them towards the environment again, or towards, how did you survive that? Right? That's, you're telling me this history, or did you do anything to make it through the day?
Right.
Or when did you feel more like yourself today, in the last week, or in the last month? So we begin to build slowly some of these different ways that there is this intrinsic rhythm that's there. And when the person is ready and they're starting to feel a little bit better and more regulated, then you can ask them, did you notice that you just took a little bit of a deeper breath? But it's not asking them to attend to their breathing when they're in the panic zone or when they're in the same old pattern. It's when it shifts more towards a regulated pattern and they have more capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Joshua, how would you respond to that? It's such an important question about working with complex trauma.
Mm-hmm. It depends a little bit, I think, on what we mean by extremely traumatized. We make a distinction between what we might call developmental trauma and what we might call shock trauma. And somebody who's extremely traumatized, that may suggest that they have both, that they have a background of developmental trauma and then have some shock traumas overlaid on top of that. Or they may have just been through some extremely distressing shock traumas. In general, we're going to presume that a shock trauma can be renegotiated fairly well if there is underlying regulatory capacity. So if I've been able to negotiate my developmental process and come through that relatively unscathed, and then I have a significant shock trauma, my system is going to likely be fairly well prepared to heal from that. So, given the right supports, given the expertise of a somatic experiencing practitioner and helping me to renegotiate it, I can do that, relatively easily. If instead, there's this developmental trauma wound such that accessing the healing relationship is difficult, that may take some time. And you know, it may actually be weeks, months, or even in some cases, you know, I'll be honest, years of building that sense of rapport, that sense of containment, so that actually working with trauma can become possible. I generally think in phases. You know, it's a lot of different modalities have their different notions of, you know, the phases of the work. But I'll tend to think that people come in, they come in because they need help, and there's dysregulation. So they're lacking in regulatory capacity. The first step, as it is for little ones, is co-regulation. So we develop together the capacity to have these cycles of activation and deactivation. You know, so they're not getting stuck in, you know, high sympathetic charge or freeze. And, you know, I'm coming in to offer myself and to direct their process so that they don't get, you know, stuck in those dysregulated patterns. And then we move into self-regulation. And, you know, I tend to think of self-regulation as having two distinct phases. One explicit, where, you know, the person is doing something to regulate themselves. There's a strategic, intentional manipulation of experience. And then implicit self-regulation, where the system begins to regulate itself. And so, you know, kind of leading people along that journey. And what I know is that, you know, for some people, that may be a, you know, 2-3 session process. You know, a person who doesn't have developmental trauma, you know, has lived a, you know, a relatively, you know, easy kind of life. They get into a really bad car accident. They're noticing symptoms afterwards, and they come in. We rework the car accident. You know, we renegotiate that process, as Abby was saying, look for these incomplete self-protective responses, facilitate the safe completion of those. They may come back into regulation and be ready to, you know, head out the door. But, you know, somebody who's had a history of developmental trauma, and or, you know, repetitive, ongoing, you know, shock traumas, that could take significantly longer, just to create that basic level of stabilization so that the renegotiation process can take place.
Right. And unfortunately, developmental trauma and continuing shock traumas tend to go together.
Absolutely. You know, the most reliable predictor of a traumatic reaction is, unsurprisingly, previous trauma.
Right.
You know, so if my nervous system has gotten dinged in that way, then it's much more likely that subsequent events that are extreme are going to provoke more of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's sad too that, you know, even though we understand now that, and it's research back now, that we need connection with other people, and we need it in our bodies, our whole physiology, our heart, everything. And yet when we've been hurt by other people, it's so difficult to reach out and connect in a way that feels satisfying or real.
And this is where somatic experiencing, because in the earliest time of our lives, what are we? We're sensory, we're motor, we're emotional. It's very basic, we call it more implicit, non-conscious memory. Most of us don't have explicit or autobiographical memory until we're 2 and older, right? It doesn't form. But it's in these early years that the attachment, right, and a lot of those patterns get set up. And one of the jobs of caregivers from a biological perspective is to be the parasympathetic nervous system for the infant. They have an underdeveloped parasympathetic nervous system, increasingly 18 months of age and then beyond. But really, they don't have that capacity. They rely on co-regulation in order to develop those pathways. So this is another place where we see people a lot of the time reaching out for substances in order to regulate themselves, because they have the blueprint. We all have the blueprint for a parasympathetic nervous system, but it's underdeveloped in a sense, right? That synaptic connectivity is not there, and it's not reliable. And so they might be reaching for a substance in order to try to regulate, and it can be important in SC, this is why we need to take it slow. It's growing the capacity to reconnect to that blueprint.
Right. And so do you use different tools to help people self-regulate until they are able to do that more internally, until their system is stronger?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and different tools potentially for different folks.
Mm-hmm.
So what I ideally want to do is meet with each person and discover where are their strengths. You know, where are there places in their lives where they're already doing something that they feel good about, and you know, find those spots. Really encourage them to dive into that more. Additionally, you know, there's in terms of getting attention out into the external environment, that can be a really stabilizing thing. And sometimes, rather than just an open-ended, you know, hey, let your eyes go where they want to go, or, you know, why don't you just let yourself be curious about our space? I may invite people, if they're subject to, you know, panic or other really uncomfortable stuff, do a task. So, you know, stop and find 5 white things in this room. So then, you know, you're not only getting the bottom-up stabilization of getting attention into the external environment, which dampens down on brain regions responsible for emotionality and, you know, self-referencing. But then I'm also recruiting the neocortex, which now has to go out and label, categorize objects, and then you know, start to put that also dampens down on you know, emotion processing brain regions. So you're kind of getting double benefit, you know, to sort of quiet things down. There's a whole, you know, slew of different things like that we can offer to folks to try to keep them out of those, you know, distressing recurring states, while we kind of start to build things, you know, in a way. So appreciate, you know, looking back at the developmental arc of the individual. Sometimes, and I've seen this be especially true with addictions, we'll think about our traumatized clients as an adult personality plunked down on top of a very immature nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like the nervous system hasn't been able to mature, but then, you know, the person has had to develop these capacities for coping and for, you know, getting by in the world. And so, you know, we sometimes, you know, have to take some time to facilitate that maturation of the nervous system. But in the meantime, yeah, definitely want to give the person some strategies for coping with things.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any more of those that you'd like to offer folks, Abby?
I'm looping around several times in our discussion because shock trauma and also developmental trauma are things that are readily spoken about as traumatizing experiences and as categories. But something that I want to mention in particular with addictions that I think is very important to keep on the radar is medical trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Early medical trauma, early medical intervention for caregivers or for the person themselves, multiple surgeries, right? Life-threatening kinds of diagnoses, any kind of anesthesia. And these are very threatening experiences for the autonomic nervous system. And in fact, when we, depending on the type of anesthesia, we can go into a state that's a lot like thanatosis. It's a near-death state. Yeah. And many people come out of these experiences with a lot of freeze, a lot of dissociation, and a lot of dysregulation. And I really want to bring that to the forefront of our discussion as well. I mean, we have different categories of trauma, right? We talk about the early development, but I think it's important for people to kind of look at their histories. Were there any surgeries? We say, oh, well, I needed the surgery in order to survive. But the biology, right, our physical beings, we're still being cut into.
Right. Mm-hmm.
We still have pain signals, and then the anesthesia itself can be a life-threatening experience. So getting some SE around these experiences as you remember the surgery? What are you noticing in your body right now?
Mm-hmm.
And that might be another place where people are self-medicating to either join some of those states or to make sense of those states, or to help to counteract some of the feelings of the helplessness and the terror that they went through. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that as a really important category of trauma that I see over and over in the addictions community that sometimes is overlooked.
Right. Yeah, and whether it's our own surgery or medical issues or those of the caregivers, all of those are very threatening. And that was not very well understood until recently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when I was a child, almost everybody I knew, including me, had our tonsils out. You know, it's nice that they're not doing that so routinely now.
Yeah. You know, I would not argue, but I'm definitely curious if it may still not be well understood how disorganizing surgeries can be.
Right.
Yeah.
True. Mm-hmm.
This brings us back to not all of these experiences are inherently traumatizing.
Mm-hmm.
With the right conditions, the right support, enough underlying regulation, time, all of these things are can really be buffers for how a person responds.
Right.
But much of the time, there can be, disruption in the underlying regulation, as we've discussed through shock or developmental trauma, or other kind of medical trauma, or it could be that there's not proper support that individual needed. Nobody was there when they came out of anesthesia, and they were terrified that they had died.
Right.
And no one was there to comfort them for 8 more hours.
Mm-hmm.
Or someone who was there blamed them and shamed them.
Very common. Yeah.
Yeah. So how we're met in relationships and how our biology responds to those things, those are sometimes some of the recipes for trauma. And of course, anywhere where there's forced immobilization, right?
Mm-hmm.
And is the kind of a recipe, and high arousal is a recipe for dissociation and freeze.
Right.
So, but not all overwhelming experiences are traumatizing. But it is important to look back at significant experiences, and I call it spring cleaning of the nervous system. Like, I don't really know. I was really surprised doing some spring cleaning of my nervous system in SE training. So I was like, oh, that surgery when I was fine. I was so little. And then I started going through it, and I had all of these different reactions to different pieces, relational pieces. I had some strange kinds of somatic echoes or memories through the anesthesia. And after I went through that session work, I felt more of a capacity to be in my life. And I asked a colleague of mine who works primarily in addictions, who's a real specialist, I said, I'm doing a summit, and I'm wondering, for you and your clients, what is something that you really think stands out that's important for people to know? And Mrs. Cindy Brooks, and she said, that the somatic experiencing approach is so potent and powerful because it allows you to be in your life in a regulated way and to feel the beauty, to be able to move through all of the elements of, stress and enjoyment and relaxation, all of the experiences of life, but not need something external to reach for. That you innately have it within you. And it's regaining that capacity that she's regained, that we've regained, many of our clients have regained through the process. And SE is being embraced by many different outpatient and inpatient facilities because it's really works. And people are going towards it. They say, I want more SE.
Right. Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. And you don't have to tell your story over and over again because it's actually not that important. I mean, it is important in a sense, but sometimes I think of it, have you ever seen the cartoons with the peanuts where the adults are talking and they're going wah, 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 to the kids.
Yeah.
Well, in some ways, the story or the things that we think about ourselves, especially when we have distortions from trauma, it's like, well, wah, 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 but what's happening in your physio? What's happening in the moment? What's happening in your being?
Mm-hmm.
Let's work. Where is the regulation? Right? Where's the resilience? Where is that pendulation? How do we restore that inherent rhythm? That's the key. And once we do that, then things start to make sense, literally make sense in the body. And then start making, there's like a new narrative that emerges from that, new fresh affect, new feelings that emerge from that bottom up, and a new ability to be reconnected in life.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm very struck by what you said about going under an anesthetic, that it feels, even if we know in our mind, our conscious mind, that it's okay, we're not going to die from it, that it feels in our body like we're dying. And we need to do something on that level. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very potent.
Yeah, Peter said that for trauma to occur, there needs to be helplessness in the face of threat. And if you think about it, what could be more helpless than being in this state of forced immobility? And what more threatening than having our body boundary violated? Mm-hmm. And so, for me, the surgical medical trauma is such a potent emblem or exemplar of a traumatic reaction. Right. Because we may fully desire this procedure. It may be life-saving, mm-hmm. and we can still be disorganized by it. The nervous system can still become dysregulated as a result. Mm-hmm. Because it's not about what we think. It's not about, our beliefs. It's about what happens to these very primitive neural circuits. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And it's renegotiable. I mean, that's the other thing. It's not that people should avoid life-saving surgeries. We need to do that. Mm-hmm. But getting some support in the before and in the aftermath. Right. From a nervous system level. Anytime that I'm going in for any kind of medical procedure, I'm getting some sessions around it and after. Within this modality, again, because it's my preferred modality, which is why I teach it, mm-hmm. because it's been so effective for me in my life.
Well, and then you don't get closed down into the system of freeze or the deep parasympathetic freeze. You can actually just move it through and then get back into enjoying life more. Mm-hmm. So I can't believe the time has gone so fast. We've been talking for an hour and 20 minutes. So we should probably go into the last little bit here. So before we close though, I'd like to know if somebody that you're working with comes in, especially with an addiction, and there's all kinds of different addictions. It could be alcohol or other drugs. It could be a process addiction or food or sex or whatever it might be. What are a couple of things, one or two things that you would say, this is a good place to start? Do you want to go first, Joshua?
Probably going to start, well away in the beginning, well away from the behavior or the substance itself. Mm-hmm. Likely by the time that somebody's seeking treatment, they've rehearsed pretty well their understanding of what they're doing, and maybe even have some insights into why. And generally, I'm not going to go into that vortex. But may instead, start to notice places where the person's doing things in their lives that they feel good about, things that we can use as a place to affirm their value as a person, and try to get some stabilization. But eventually, for me, when I think about so a quick little understanding for me. When I work with people, I recognize that on some level, there's always two individuals that I'm treating: personality and the organism. So mm-hmm. there's the meaning that people make of their lives and themselves, and then there's what's happening on this more basic bodily, neural primitive level. And want to recognize that the meaning that people make of their lives sometimes actually is disorganizing. So to work to, facilitate the emergence of some kind of different structure of making meaning is key. But if there's, if there's this regular interruption of what's happening by going towards a substance or a behavior that's, useful to an extent to keep things somewhat regulated, but ultimately disorganizing, we're going to have to develop ways to move out of that pattern. So, one of the things is just like noticing any cue, anything at all that takes us out of that pattern, out of that path. Like, there's, people in addiction sometimes talk about the still small voice, listening for that little whisper that says, I don't actually want to do this, or I'm desiring something else. Sometimes we might encourage people to set timers, to say, you can absolutely take that substance or engage in that behavior, but just set a timer for, as long as you can. Could be 5 minutes, could even be 1 minute, and just pay attention to what's happening on the physiological level. Oftentimes that feeling of a overwhelming desire, can pass, and that can be an enormously important learning for people. That they do have this resilience, they do have the capacity to go into the excitation of the desire to act out, and that can pass. They can deactivate and come back into a different state
without the substance or the drug or something. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very important. We have to experience that in our system before we really believe it. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
For sure.
What about you, Abby?
Yeah, similarly, the one thing that I remember reading about this summit is that it's focusing on the pain that's underneath, right? The deep pain that we hold from overwhelm, from neglect.
Right.
And again, we're looking at this from a biological, survival-based perspective, from a nervous system perspective. So to help people learn to gently attune with curiosity to their nervous system. And similar to Joshua, we're going to start well away, look for some intrinsic regulation, build up some more of the capacity. And then we're going to start to move towards working more with the trauma, with the craving. And if you can say, really rewind, what happens right before? Mm-hmm. Or as you think about that, what are you noticing in your body right now? And then the office, we're going to notice, do they go into shutdown? Do they go into high arousal? Do they start to move? And then we're going to find some ways for them to pay attention, maybe to some different areas of their body that are more regulated, that then help to decrease whatever the charge or the dysregulation is. Or maybe there's a way in which their hands are, they're talking about how, they're really feeling this craving and their heart rate is up, but they have their hands connected to their shoulder. And you say, well, what about your hands on your shoulder? How is that? Mm-hmm. Or we might have practiced some stabilization tools. We could go into grounding or orienting or, noticing somewhere that feels better. And whatever works in the office, we can create that as something that they can start to practice.
Ah, right.
Just like what Josh was saying, it's more of an explicit tool at first, but as they practice it more, that underlying regulation starts to occur on its own, and it becomes an implicit process where the craving is diminished and more regulation is occurring, and there are more options, right, in those situations. We also may need to go back into the developmental history, into the shock trauma history, the medical trauma, and do some event-based work if you're a therapist. We also have many body workers or mindfulness-based teachers who are trained in SE who work with this as well. But from a mental health perspective, we might take one of those events and work from it from the beginning to the end with little piece by piece. And every time we're taking a little piece and then we're wiping away the story. We're not going to the worst part. We're not letting them go to the worst part. We're actually holding it. Take a little bit of a drop. We call this titration, drop by drop. And then pausing and then notice, how is the body responding in the present moment to that little piece? And can we find some new regulation or new experience around that memory?
Mm-hmm.
Right? The explicit, the more narrative memory, but also the implicit, the non-conscious memory, to reorganize that. And then we move on to another piece. So it's a slower process, and it takes us, use a little bit of narrative and then body process. So this would be the way that also going underneath some of those earlier experiences to renegotiate them at this very primitive level, which connects then to the higher orders of the brain, to the hippocampus emotional processing, and to the neocortex, so that we then become more of an integrated functional system.
Mm-hmm. So this, the titration and that going back and forth are really key elements, the pendulation and the titration.
Core elements of somatic experiencing in the process of the work.
Right, right. Well, and it seems to me that in addition to building resilience, you're also building safety and the ability to stay with what it is that's happening in the system, partly because you know it's not going to be there forever. You're going back and forth and moving in and coming back and using the body's strength to come to a steadier place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it builds emotion regulation,
Right.
which in many ways is the key. And Bill W. Came up with this too shall pass.
Mm-hmm.
Which is it's emotion regulation slogan.
Right.
But when you're in the trauma vortex, you don't know.
Right. Yeah, it's so overwhelming. It feels like it's going to be here forever.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that occurs in the trauma vortex is there's a fixity in the neurobiological lower brain, right? So we actually, until we can attend to some different qualities and move the organism through time, complete some of the defensive and survival responses, allow time for discharge and reorganization. That's another key element here, that we really allow time for that lower brain processing, which is a slower process. People are smart. You could decide, I don't want to be addicted to opioids anymore. I just want to stop drinking because it's really interrupting my relationships. And okay, I understand why that happened. I understand why I do it. They just stop.
Mm-hmm.
But it's where, right, we have these lower signals that we really need to work with, slow down, take piece by piece, allow that deeper reorganization to happen.
Right. Yeah, and circling back to something you said earlier, Joshua, about how human beings aren't really built, our brains, our systems aren't built to live the way we're living right now. Over all this time we've evolved, it has not been in the modern society that we're in now.
Yeah.
It's true.
You're doing pretty good, all things considered.
Yeah, that's true. So how do people get in touch with you, and how, what would, I know you have the websites for Peter Levine's work and for your own as well. Why don't we get those out there and then people can get in touch?
Joshua?
Okay, so if people are potentially interested in training in somatic experiencing and or finding a somatic experiencing practitioner, they can go to the website of the Somatic Experiencing Trauma Institute, which is www.traumahealing.org.
Mm-hmm.
To learn more about Peter Levine and his current projects, you can go to somaticexperiencing.com. If you are interested in getting in touch with me, my website is my last name, Sylvae, which is spelled SYLVAE.net.
Okay.
And same for the trainings. Joshua and I both teach somatic experiencing trainings, and those are available for professionals that have practices. So we don't have them for individual healing. If people are interested in finding an SE practitioner, they can also go to traumahealing.org. And we have a practitioner registry, and we have practitioners all over the world. Really wonderful to see the way that SE is growing. And if you would like to find me directly, I have a website, which is Abby Blakeslee, ABIBLAKESLEE.com.
Great. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. This has been really interesting. And I think we'll give people a good sense of their nervous system and how to work with that and build that, that internal resilience and self-regulation that we really need, that underlies so much of addiction. One of the things that Scott Kiloby realized very soon after he opened the Kiloby Center was that it's all about trauma, and that a lot of treatment centers stay away from trauma at the beginning, and he doesn't do that. He goes right into working with healing the system of trauma right away, and then moving into healing the addiction. So obviously, if there's drugs or alcohol, they've gone to detox first, and then there's an abstinence around that. But that really, if you're not working with the underlying trauma, then you're just going to keep coming back into some kind of an addictive pattern until we heal what's underneath. So. Yeah, looks like we're all in alignment around that.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. This was fun.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. It's wonderful.
Go to kilobicenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, for access to the interviews. You can watch them free online, or you could purchase an all-access pass. kilobicenter.com.